started as any ordinary Friday. Emma had texted me earlier that day, saying she had a work dinner. Her tone was casual, almost too casual. Something in her message didn't sit right with me, but I pushed it aside. I convinced myself I was just tired or overthinking it. But as the evening dragged on, I started to get that familiar itch at the back of my mind. The one that tells you something isn't adding up. Around 8 p.m., I was scrolling mindlessly through my phone when a notification popped up, a tagged post from one of her colleagues. My curiosity got the better of me and I clicked it. The picture wasn't anything particularly scandalous, just a group shot at a trendy, dimly lit restaurant. But my eyes were drawn immediately to Emma. She was leaning in close, laughing at something, her hand resting on the thigh of the man sitting next to her. Her hand, barely touching, but somehow intentionally placed. My stomach twisted. I stared at the photo for what felt like an eternity. The way she was looking at him, casual, playful, like she didn't have a care in the world, set off an explosion of emotions inside me. This wasn't the woman I thought I knew. I zoomed in, scouring her face, his face, her body language, desperate for something I could explain away. But the feeling only grew. Every pixel of that image was a betrayal I hadn't seen coming. I could have texted her right then and there or called her, demanding answers. But no, somewhere deep down, I knew I needed to confront this differently. I wanted to see it with my own eyes. So I threw on a jacket, grabbed my keys, and drove straight to the restaurant without another thought. The place was upscale with a sleek, modern vibe, the kind where everyone's pretending to be someone they're not. I slipped in, my heart pounding, and scanned the room. It didn't take long to find her. They were seated at a table near the back, half hidden behind a low wall and dim lighting. But I could see enough. There she was, smiling, relaxed, her whole body angled toward him like he was the only person in the world. He leaned in closer, whispered something in her ear that made her laugh, and she playfully smacked his arm. I felt a surge of anger, something raw and blinding. I took a breath, trying to steady myself, then pulled the envelope out of my pocket. I'd grabbed it on my way out. An envelope filled with every shared memory, every anniversary card, every "I love you" note she'd ever given me. I wanted her to see the weight of what she was throwing away. I walked up to their table and for a moment, neither of them even noticed me. Emma was too wrapped up in her little world with him. Then, as I placed the envelope on the table, her smile froze. She looked up at me, her eyes wide, like a deer caught in headlights. I leaned in just enough for them both to hear. "You left something behind." Emma's expression shifted from shock to irritation almost instantly, like I was the one intruding on her night. The guy she was with, slicked back hair, smug grin, looked between us, clearly amused but trying to play it off. He gave me this quick, dismissive look, as if I was some stranger who'd accidentally wandered into the wrong scene. Emma grabbed the envelope, her hands shaky. I didn't say anything, didn't raise my voice. I just looked at her, waiting. 1,000 questions churned in my mind, but I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of seeing how hurt I was. This was her mess to explain, and I was going to watch her try to dig her way out. Finally, she cleared her throat, plastering on that same forced smile she used with waiters when she was being difficult. "What are you doing here, Jake?" Her voice was sweet and calm, like I just walked in on her harmlessly catching up with an old friend. I raised an eyebrow. "Funny. I was about to ask you the same thing." I motioned to her hand, still resting on the guy's thigh. "You seem comfortable." Her face went pale, but she recovered quickly, letting out a small, fake laugh. "Jake, you're being ridiculous. This is just a work dinner. You know Paul from accounting, right?" She gestured to him, and Paul, or whoever he was, gave a little nod, smirking like he found this whole situation wildly entertaining. I was about to lose it. I leaned over the table, keeping my voice steady. "Work dinners don't usually involve hand-holding, and whatever that was." I pointed to her hand still resting on his leg. She pulled it back as if she'd been caught doing something as minor as texting during a meeting, but her eyes glinted with defiance. She scoffed, crossing her arms. "Jake, you're blowing this way out of proportion. Can we not do this here? "You're embarrassing yourself." I took a step back, laughing despite myself. Embarrassing myself? I felt like I was in some twisted game, with her manipulating the rules as we went along. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time I saw someone I didn't recognize. A stranger who seemed more concerned with her image than the life we'd built together. Her colleague, Paul, or whatever he was really called, shifted in his seat, leaning back, looking completely unbothered. "Maybe you should go, man," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. In that moment, it took every ounce of willpower I had not to cause a scene. Instead, I looked straight at Emma and gave her a choice, simple and clear. "Come home with me now or stay here with him. But understand, if you stay, you're making a choice." Her eyes flickered between us. For a second, I thought she'd get up, apologize, make this right. But instead, she just looked away, pretending to be distracted by her drink. And that was the moment I knew exactly where we stood. I walked out of that restaurant with my heart pounding, barely able to catch my breath. Every step toward my car felt heavier than the last, like I was wading through a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I'd given her a chance, one clear, straightforward chance to salvage this, to choose us, and she'd blown it off like I was some jealous boyfriend she barely knew. Sitting in the driver's seat, I gripped the wheel, staring at the restaurant doors, half expecting her to come running out, apologizing, begging me to talk. But after 5 minutes, then 10, there was no sign of her. I realized slowly that she wasn't coming. She'd chosen to stay in there with him. I could have driven home, but something in me didn't want to face our house just yet. The photos on the walls, the memories in every corner, all of it now tainted. So I just drove, no destination in mind, my mind replaying every moment of that night, analyzing every word she'd said. I thought about all the times I'd defended her, trusted her, believed her lies. Then, like a switch flipping, I remembered something that hit me like a gut punch. Her business trips. She'd been taking them more frequently in the past few months, saying she had to meet with important clients in different cities. Every time I'd asked to join her, she'd shut it down, saying it would be too boring for me or that the schedules were too tight for us to enjoy ourselves. I'd laughed it off back then, thinking she was just trying to spare me from hours of her work meetings. But now I saw the pattern for what it was, a perfectly curated lie. I pulled over in an empty parking lot and sat there in the dark, my phone burning in my pocket. For a second, I considered calling her, but what was the point? I'd already watched her make her choice. I opened her social media instead, scrolling back through the months, my mind racing. I was looking for anything I might have missed, clues that were right in front of me the whole time. And that's when I saw it. A picture she'd posted from a work trip 3 months ago, a weekend when she'd claimed she was attending a conference in Chicago. I remembered that weekend clearly because I'd made her favorite dinner to surprise her when she got home. In the picture, she was in a bar, a drink in hand, laughing at something off camera. First, it looked innocent enough. But then I noticed something, her other hand, barely visible, resting on the arm of a man just out of the frame. Only his shoulder was in view, but it was enough. It was unmistakably him. The same guy from the restaurant tonight. Couldn't believe it. She'd been flaunting this in plain sight, laughing while I was sitting at home, blind and trusting. My hands shook as I stared at the picture, feeling the betrayal cut deeper and deeper. How many other weekends, other work trips had been lies? All the signs I'd ignored, the excuses I'd brushed off. They crashed over me, each one a reminder of how thoroughly she'd played me. And I felt, for the first time, the weight of just how much she'd shattered everything we had. In that silent parking lot, I finally let the anger flood over me. She had stolen moments from our life, twisting them into lies, making me believe her stories, her excuses. I realized I couldn't let this slide. I couldn't just go home and wait for her to walk through the door, like nothing had happened. No, this was far from over. The next morning, I was running on no sleep, but something had clicked inside me. The shock was gone, replaced by a grim clarity. I couldn't just confront her like any other cheated husband. No, I needed her to feel every inch of what she'd put me through. I wanted her to understand that I wasn't just going to lie down and accept this. So I planned. Emma texted me around 9 a.m., saying she'd be home later because her work dinner had ended late. She threw in an apology, some excuse about the restaurant being so busy they'd stayed longer than expected. I laughed to myself, stunned at the nerve. She had no idea that I already knew the truth, that I'd seen everything with my own eyes. I decided to play along. I texted back something casual. Sure. Hope you had a good night. My fingers itched to type more, to throw in some accusation, but I held back. She wasn't expecting me to be cool and composed, which meant I had the advantage. I just had to be patient. While I waited, I dug deeper. I called her office and spoke to her assistant under the pretense of planning a surprise trip. I mentioned a few dates Emma had been out of town on business. To my complete lack of surprise, the assistant's response was hesitant and full of holes. Apparently, Emma had never been on official business those weekends, but the assistant was too flustered to ask more questions. I thanked her and hung up, stomach churning as the reality hit me all over again. She hadn't even covered her tracks that well. She'd simply assumed I'd never check. By noon, I had everything I needed. A hotel receipt from a weekend she'd claimed to be in Boston, booked in her name but for 2 guests, the message trail of her business dinners from her public social media posts, and even a close-up of that infamous photo with Paul from accounting. Every bit of evidence I tucked into an envelope, the same kind I'd placed on her table last night. But this time, it was fuller, heavier. A record of her deceptions, meticulously collected, as undeniable as it was damning. She came home around 4 p.m., slipping inside quietly. I was sitting on the couch, calm as ever, the envelope on the coffee table in front of me. She looked at me, hesitant, like she wasn't sure which version of me she was about to face. "Hey," she said, dropping her bag by the door. "How's your day been?" I motioned to the seat across from me. "Take a seat, Emma. We need to talk." Her face flickered with something, a hint of guilt, maybe, or fear, but she quickly masked it, walking over with a neutral expression. She sat down, crossing her arms, trying to act casual. "Is this about last night? Because I told you, Jake, you completely misunderstood." "Is that so?" I said, picking up the envelope and sliding it across the table toward her. "Why don't you take a look at what I've misunderstood?" She glanced at the envelope, then back at me, her face paling. But she didn't open it right away. Instead, she put on that defiant, almost dismissive look she always used when she felt cornered. "Jake, I don't know what you think you figured out, but you're overreacting. Whatever you think you saw, it's not what you think. Open it," I said, my voice calm but firm. She hesitated, her fingers trembling slightly as she picked up the envelope. She opened it, pulling out the stack of papers, her eyes darting over the photos, the receipts, the notes I'd compiled. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She just stared, a deer frozen in headlights. I leaned back, watching her unravel in real time. "So, care to explain? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks pretty clear." She looked up, panicked, but tried to hold her ground. "Jake, these don't mean what you think. Those trips, I did go for work, but Paul just happened to be staying in the same hotel. So we grabbed dinner, nothing more." I almost laughed. "Really? The same hotel, the same nights, every time?" She fumbled, shuffling through the pages, looking for something she could use to twist the narrative in her favor. It's not what it looks like, okay? This whole thing is a misunderstanding. Paul and I are just friends, Jake." Her voice grew sharper, but so did mine. "Friends don't lie about where they've been, Emma. Friends don't have late-night dinners and hold hands at restaurants. And friends certainly don't go on weekend getaways together while pretending to be somewhere else." I could see it in her eyes, the realization that she was trapped, that every excuse she threw at me only made her web of lies more obvious. But even then, she couldn't admit it, couldn't own up to what she'd done. In that moment, I knew the woman in front of me would never tell me the truth. She'd rather lie and fight and dodge until there was nothing left. And as I sat there, staring into the eyes of a stranger, I felt the last thread holding our marriage together snap. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, as Emma stared down at the papers. I could see the gears turning in her mind, scrambling for a way to salvage her story. But she wasn't apologizing, wasn't even showing an ounce of regret. Just that same look of defiance, as if I was the one pushing her into a corner for no reason. Finally, she dropped the papers back on the table, crossed her arms, and looked me dead in the eye, her voice dripping with annoyance. "Jake, do you even hear yourself? You've always been so paranoid, so clingy. If I can't even go on a trip without you tracking my every move, what does that say about you?" I felt a surge of anger flare up, but I forced myself to keep calm. "Emma, this isn't about me tracking you. I only started putting this together when I saw you with him last night. I wasn't the one sneaking around." She threw her hands up, scoffing. "Oh, so you think this makes you a hero? Snooping through my business, showing up at my work dinner? Do you even realize how controlling that is?" It was like she was twisting everything, trying to flip this whole mess onto me, like I was the one who'd crossed a line. I could barely believe the gall, the sheer nerve she had to turn her betrayal into an attack on me. I shook my head, almost laughing. "Emma, I didn't have to snoop. You left clues everywhere. You didn't even bother covering it up." She leaned forward, glaring at me with this cold, calculated look. "Maybe I didn't because I knew you'd blow things out of proportion, Jake. I can't even breathe around you without you reading into everything." Her tone was sharp, dismissive, like she was scolding a child. "You don't understand what it's like to want, I don't know, freedom sometimes." There it was, the confession buried in 1,000 excuses. She'd been stepping out, choosing freedom, while I was sitting at home, loyal, taking care of everything, trusting her. And somehow, she wanted to paint herself as the victim of my supposed clinginess, my controlling behavior. I took a deep breath, holding back the storm I felt brewing inside. "Freedom," I said, voice low and steady. "Emma, I've given you freedom. You've gone on trips alone, had nights out with friends, taken as much time as you wanted. But this isn't freedom. It's deceit. And it's not about me being clingy. It's about respect. And you've thrown that out the window." She rolled her eyes, brushing my words off like they meant nothing. "Respect? Jake, you've always had these weird expectations of me. You wanted the perfect wife, didn't you? The one who stays at home, doesn't have her own life, who's just there waiting for you every night." Her voice grew louder, and she leaned in, challenging me. "Well, I'm sorry I don't fit into your little fantasy. Maybe you should ask yourself why I had to look elsewhere to feel alive." Alive. She had the audacity to blame her betrayal on some vague idea of feeling alive. It wasn't an apology. It was an insult, a way to justify everything she'd done as if her needs had outweighed any vow she'd made to me. I stood up, suddenly overwhelmed, unable to sit there and listen to her twisted reasoning for another second. "Emma, if you wanted alive, you could have talked to me. You could have told me you were unhappy instead of sneaking around behind my back. I would have done anything to make this work." She watched me, expression unchanged, as if my words were just noise to her. I could see it in her face. She wasn't sorry. She had no remorse, no empathy for what she'd done to us. Instead, she looked at me with this hardened, bitter expression, like she'd been waiting to unleash this entire speech on me for years. "Maybe you would have," she said, her tone cold and final. "But it's too late now, isn't it?" There was a finality in her words that hit me hard. I realized then that she didn't even want to fix things. She wanted to hold onto her own version of the story, one where she was the one who'd been wronged, the one who had every reason to do what she'd done. And with that, I knew exactly where we stood. I nodded, taking in the reality of the moment. "You're right, Emma. It's too late." I reached down, picked up the envelope, and tossed it back onto the table in front of her. "Keep it. It's a reminder of everything you've chosen." And with that, I walked out of the room, her silence trailing behind me like an echo, and left her there to sit with the pieces she'd broken. I shut the door to our bedroom and leaned against it, taking in the quiet that filled the house. The air was thick, like it was holding on to every unspoken word, every piece of our broken history. I stared at the empty room, realizing that, in a way, it had been empty long before tonight. Emma didn't follow. She stayed in the living room, probably staring at that envelope, but I knew she wouldn't bother reading through it. She wouldn't spend a second longer than she had to facing what she'd done. Emma was the type to step over the broken pieces and pretend the mess had always been there. I'd let her dodge questions, brush things off, and slowly chip away at us because I'd never thought she'd truly betray me. I sat on the edge of the bed, my mind racing through a blur of memories. Our wedding day, the road trips, the lazy weekends spent binge-watching shows and eating takeout, her laugh echoing through every room. It felt surreal that all of those moments had led to this, to a point where every memory I once cherished was tainted with questions, with doubt. At some point, I picked up my phone, instinctively scrolling through old photos, and I stumbled on one from last Christmas. We'd hosted our friends, laughing as we played cards, taking silly pictures by the fireplace. Emma had looked so happy that night, her arms wrapped around me, her eyes bright. How long had she been seeing him, I wondered? Had she already been lying to me back then? I wanted to go back in time, to warn myself, to tell the man in that photo to open his eyes. But it was pointless, and I knew it. There was no going back, no fixing what she'd done. And the longer I sat there, the clearer it became. This wasn't the end of one fight or a rough patch. This was the end, period. After what felt like hours, I heard her footsteps outside the door. She knocked once, hesitant, like she wasn't sure if she was welcome anymore. "Jake, can we talk?" Her voice was softer, almost pleading. I opened the door, but only halfway, keeping my face as blank as I could manage. "What is there to talk about, Emma? You made your choice." She looked down, fiddling with her wedding ring, an absent, nervous habit she'd had for years. I don't know what happened back there," she said, voice shaking. "I know I've made mistakes, but we can work through this. I've been confused." "Okay?" "Confused," I said, disbelief creeping into my tone. Confused doesn't cover months of lying, hiding, sneaking around. Don't pretend this was some mistake. You knew exactly what you were doing. Her face hardened again, the vulnerability gone in an instant. "Maybe I did," she shot back, anger flaring up. "But you've never exactly made things easy, have you?" "I needed space, Jake. I needed to feel something that wasn't just being your wife, tied down to this routine." I stared at her, feeling like I was finally seeing her true self, laid bare. "So that's it? You're the victim because marriage didn't live up to your expectations? You needed excitement, so you just threw me away?" She flinched, but her jaw tightened. "Don't act like you were some perfect husband. You never listened to me, never really saw me. You've been too wrapped up in your own world to care about mine." The words hit me, but this time they didn't sting like she intended. Instead, they made me feel free. Free from trying to understand her twisted reasoning. Free from justifying her actions in my mind. I realized I didn't need to keep fighting her on this, to keep peeling back the layers of excuses and half-truths she was spinning. She'd already shown me exactly who she was. I took a step back, opening the door wider, but I didn't invite her in. "Emma, you've made it pretty clear that you're done with this marriage. I think you need to leave." Her face paled, and for a moment, I thought she might argue, might beg or try to twist things once more. But instead, she looked at me with this strange, unreadable expression, a mix of anger and shock. She nodded once, lips pressed into a thin line, then turned and walked down the hallway without a word. I watched her go, feeling the finality of her footsteps as they faded down the stairs. She gathered a few things, not even bothering to look back, and then the front door closed softly behind her. Just like that, she was gone. I stood alone in the silence, feeling an odd sense of relief wash over me. The hurt was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but for the first time in months, I felt a weight lift. I'd spent too long chasing after someone who'd left me long before tonight. And now, with her gone, I was finally free to face the future, whatever it held, on my own terms, The silence in the house was deafening. I stood there, in the middle of the living room, surrounded by all the little pieces of our life together. Everything felt strangely surreal, like I was standing in a stranger's home, not mine. The photos on the wall, the blanket she'd bought for the couch, her favorite mug sitting on the counter. They were all here, like ghosts of what used to be. But she was gone, and somehow that made everything else seem hollow. I sat down, letting the weight of the empty house settle over me. The truth was sinking in now. Emma was out there, living whatever version of freedom she'd convinced herself she needed. And I was here, left with the rubble of everything I'd once trusted. I glanced over at the envelope I'd left on the coffee table. It was still sitting there, opened and discarded, its contents spilled across the table. I hadn't bothered to put any of it away, like I wanted those pieces of her betrayal to stay in the open, to serve as a reminder that this was real. As I stared at the scattered evidence of her lies, a part of me wanted to burn it all, to get rid of every reminder of her deception. But instead, I picked up the photo from that business trip she'd taken 3 months ago, the one where she was sitting close to him at the bar, her hand resting on his arm just out of sight. I remembered how, back then, I texted her, telling her I missed her, asking her to come home early if she could. She'd replied with some sweet, dismissive response about how she couldn't wait to see me, while all the while, she'd been with him. I felt a new surge of anger rise up, sharper and more focused than before. I realized that anger was the only thing keeping me grounded right now, the only thing that made sense in this mess of betrayal and emptiness. I could either let myself drown in the sadness, in the haunting memories, or I could cling to that anger like a lifeline and let it push me forward. Taking a deep breath, I gathered up the photos, the receipts, every single shred of evidence, and put them back in the envelope. I didn't want these reminders lying around, didn't want her ghost haunting every corner of this house. I shoved the envelope into a drawer in the kitchen, somewhere out of sight but not quite out of mind. Someday I'd decide what to do with it, but for now I needed to start fresh. It was only when I opened the closet to grab a coat that I noticed the small box she'd left behind on the top shelf. A box of keepsakes from our years together. Ticket stubs, little notes, souvenirs from trips we'd taken. I hadn't noticed it in ages, hadn't even remembered it was there. I pulled it down, staring at the dusty lid, hesitating. Against my better judgment, I opened it. Inside were all the pieces of the life we'd built. The love notes we'd written each other, photos from those first years when everything was new and exciting, little trinkets from the trips we'd taken together. It felt like I was holding a time capsule from a life that no longer existed. I went through the items one by one, feeling the ache of each memory, each moment that once meant everything. I realized how much I'd been clinging to an illusion, a version of her that no longer existed, maybe never really had. The woman I'd loved had become a stranger, someone capable of lying with ease, someone who'd left me sitting in this empty house, holding the remnants of a life we'd never truly shared. I put the lid back on the box, not out of anger but out of clarity. It was like closing a chapter in a book, a chapter one knew I could never go back to, no matter how much a part of me wished it were possible. I knew now that clinging to this pain, to these memories, wouldn't change anything. It was time to let it go, to make room for whatever came next. And as I sat there, surrounded by the quiet of the house, I finally let myself feel the full weight of it all. The loss, the betrayal, but also a strange sense of hope. Emma had chosen her path, and now so would I. The future was blank, wide open, and for the first time that didn't scare me. The next few days were a strange blur. I fell into a rhythm of work, errands, and long drives with no destination in mind. Anything to keep my mind occupied, to keep from falling back into the questions and memories that still haunted me at odd moments. I took her things and boxed them up, piece by piece, each item a fragment of a life I was finally letting go of. But even as I went through these motions, I could feel something shifting, loosening, like I was starting to come up for air after being underwater for too long. With each item I packed away, the house felt less like a painful reminder and more like a blank canvas. I'd look around and imagine new possibilities, a different layout for the furniture, new photos on the walls, Even small changes like new curtains or a fresh coat of paint. It was an attempt to make this space mine again, to reclaim it from the ghost of our past.